Hello, today I am going to make 3 different traditional Swiss bread. These are also the type of breads that my family usually eat for breakfast or dinner. Don't forget to check the description box for the materials. Before you begin, don't forget to condition the clay that you will be using. Take your scrap clay and make 2 thin long lugs. We are going to make Topfbrot. Topfbrot is one of the most common bread in Switzerland and traditionally a Swiss treat that is indulged in on Sundays for breakfast or brunch. It is eaten with butter and jam or butter and honey, and I like mine with butter and apricot jam. Once you have your 2 logs, place 1 log on top to form a cross. I assign a number for each end so it would be easier to understand. Bring the tip of number 1 towards number 2 and number 2 to number 1. Then bring number 3 towards number 4 and number 4 towards number 3. Then again, go back to number 1 and number 2. Repeat this process until everything is used, then tuck the excess clay. This is the hardest part of making the braided bread. Make sure that you are using a well-conditioned clay because if not, they will tend to break while braiding them. Next, squeeze the clay inward so the gaps between the braids will become smaller. Using a stylus, fill the gap of the braid as much as you can by pressing the bulgy part inward or towards the opening. You can also add clay if necessary. Then completely bake the scrap clay. Here's a close-up look of the scrap clay. For me, this doesn't look like a Topfbrot because it has a much deeper lines and gaps. So what I'm going to do is to make a silicone mold. So here I am going to combine 2 equal parts of these 2 components, the putty mold, and it will take about 20 minutes for the silicone to dry. Once the silicone is well combined, immediately mold the baked clay. The reason why I am using a mold because it gives a better and more realistic result. Then let the silicone completely cure. Once the silicone is cured and no longer sticky, you can remove the model clay. You can now add the cream-colored or off-white clay in the silicone mold. Remove any excess clay if necessary. Make sure to give the clay a nice press so that it will get the nice texture from the silicone mold. After that, you can remove the clay from the mold. If the clay is too soft, refrigerate it for a few minutes before removing from the mold. I then added some texture and also some more lines to make it look much nicer. After adding the texture, I am going to add the shading. And these are the colors that I am going to use. I begin shading the bread all over with the 2 lightest yellow. And I also used a much bigger brush. Then I added the rest of the color to the light yellow mixture to create a golden brown color. I was just bullseyeing the color and used a photo as a reference, and I also used a smaller brush to shade the bulgy part of the bread. After adding the shading, you can either set it aside or bake it completely. The next bread is much easier and you don't need to use a mold here. This bread is called Panetta Ticinese. So roll small logs about 4 to 5 pieces and line them together. Slice the midsection and use a rubber tool or a sculpting tool to create a wider opening. So, Panetta Ticinese is a white bread and used to be a luxury bread up until early 20th century. This bread comes from the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland. In the middle of the work, I decided to add one more log to make it look much bigger and much nicer, I guess. I used a dotting tool to create a texture on the bread, and then I also used a pointy tool to create the texture on the crevice of the bread. For the shading, I used the same technique like on the first bread. I started with the lightest yellow mixture and then worked my way up to the darkest. The most important thing to remember in shading this bread is to not shade the crevice or the opening because this needs to be in the lighter shade. After shading, you can set them aside. The last bread we are making is the puri broth or the farmer's bread. So form a ball and flatten the bottom to create a dome shape. Using a knife or blade, create a shallow line to create several squares or diamond shape. Use a rubber sculpting tool to make the lines wider and lift the squares. You can push the rubber inward so that you can have a nice looking and protruding square. This bread in real life is kind of dark, and that is because of the rye flour that is being used. So later when we shade the bread, we will ditch the two lightest color and only use the remaining darker colors. Then using something sharp, I also added some texture on the lines of the bread. If you don't have this kind of tool, you can also use a toothpick or this sculpting steel brush. And by the way, this tool that I am using is not officially for clay. This is actually a dental tool to pick on the tooth. I just find it really nice to work with it, so I kind of use it with the clay. After you are done giving the bread its texture, you can start shading them. As you can see here, I started with the darker shade, which is the final color of the first two breads. But here, it's the first shade that I'm going to use. And then I added a much darker color, and finally I used the dark brown chalk pastel for the final shading. And lastly, bake all the breads. After baking, take the farmer's bread and add gloss. While the gloss is still wet, add chalk pastel powder on top to resemble the floor. You can blow or shake off the excess. And for the other two breads, simply apply gloss on the bulgy part and then let them completely dry. Thank you for watching this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it, and don't forget to click the subscribe button and get notified for new videos. Bye bye and see you next Saturday.